was around 2:17 in the morning when Daniel Harper, a 34-year-old taxi driver from Chicago, got a ride request that changed everything. And even now, 5 years later, he still refuses to drive after midnight because of what happened that night. Daniel had been working long hours because money was tight, his wife Emily was pregnant, bills were stacking up, and every late night ride meant extra cash. But that night felt wrong from the start because the streets were unusually empty. There was a strange fog hanging low over the roads, even though rain hadn't fallen all week, and his radio kept cutting in a static every few minutes like someone was trying to speak through it. Then his phone pinged with a pickup request from a place called Willow Creek Road, a narrow road outside the city, near a wooded area that most locals avoided because there had been stories for years about people disappearing there. But Daniel ignored that because money was money. I still don't know if I did the right thing. What would you have done if you were me? Tell me in the comments. So he accepted the ride and drove 20 minutes out until city lights disappeared behind him and only darkness surrounded his cab. And when he finally reached the pickup point, he saw something that made his stomach tighten. A woman standing alone on the side of the road wearing a pale yellow dress that looked old, like something from the 1970s, her long black hair hanging over half her face, standing perfectly still in the fog, not waving, not moving, just waiting. Daniel almost drove away because something about her felt unnatural, but then she slowly lifted her head and stepped toward the taxi, opened the back door, and sat down without saying a word, and instantly the inside of the cab became freezing cold. So cold Daniel could see his own breath, and in the rearview mirror he noticed her skin looked pale gray, almost lifeless, her lips cracked and dry, and her eyes looked hollow, like darkness filled them instead of pupils. Then in a soft whisper she said, "Take me home," and Daniel cleared his throat and asked for the address. But she stayed silent for 10 full seconds before saying, "You'll know when we get there," which sent a chill down his spine, but Daniel nervously laughed and started driving, hoping she was just some strange woman. Yet every time he looked in the mirror, she was staring directly at him without blinking. And after 5 minutes he noticed something worse. Her reflection wasn't always there. Sometimes the mirror showed an empty back seat for just a second before she appeared again. And then his radio suddenly turned on by itself, static screaming through the speakers before a broken voice whispered, "Don't take her there," then silence. Daniel's hand shook on the wheel, and he reached to turn the radio off, but from the back seat the woman whispered, "Keep driving," in a voice deeper than before, almost like two voices speaking together. So Daniel kept going because fear had locked his body, and soon the GPS completely stopped working, the screen going black except for one line of text that appeared by itself. "Turn left." Even though there was no road on the map, but ahead in the fog Daniel saw a dirt road leading into thick woods, and somehow his hands turned the wheel without him deciding to do it, like something else was controlling him, and branches scraped violently across the cab windows like fingers trying to get inside, while the woman in the back softly hummed a lullaby that Daniel somehow recognized from childhood, even though he had never heard it before. And deeper into the woods, he began seeing shapes standing between trees. Tall figures, too thin to be human, with glowing white eyes watching the taxi pass. And each time lightning flashed in the distance, those figures seemed closer. Then suddenly the woman said, "Stop here." And Daniel slammed on the brakes in front of an old house hidden deep in the woods. A rotting farmhouse with broken windows and a porch hanging sideways. And hanging from a dead tree outside were dozens of old rusted wind chimes that made no sound even though wind moved them. And the woman slowly stepped out of the taxi, then turned toward Daniel, and for the first time he fully saw her face. It looked torn open from forehead to chin like cracked porcelain, black liquid dripping from inside her mouth. And she smiled impossibly wide before saying, "Wait for my family," then walked into the house and disappeared. Daniel sat frozen for nearly a minute before every light in the cab shut off at once. The engine died, and from all around the car came knocking, soft at first, then louder, then violently pounding from every window. And when lightning flashed, Daniel looked outside and saw people standing around the taxi, dozens of them. Men, women, children, all pale, all soaked in mud, all staring at him with dead empty eyes, their mouths hanging open too wide. And then they began smiling, and slowly they tapped on the glass in rhythm, whispering together, "Take us home, take us home, take us home." Daniel screamed and tried starting the cab, but nothing happened. Then one of the figures, a little boy with blood running from his eyes, pressed his face against the window and whispered, "She chose you." And suddenly the back door opened by itself, the cold rushing in, and Daniel felt someone sit behind him, even though he never saw who entered. Then a wet voice right next to his ear whispered, "Drive," and instantly the engine started, headlights turned on, and Daniel hit the gas, speeding blindly through the woods while horrible laughter followed behind him. Branches smashing the car, ghostly hands slapping the windows. In the rearview mirror, he saw the back seat packed full of silent, pale faces staring at him, shoulder to shoulder, smiling, but when he blinked, they were gone. And somehow Daniel made it back to the highway just before dawn, shaking uncontrollably, crying, barely breathing. And when sunlight touched the taxi, everything became normal again, except for one thing. On the backseat floor was an old faded photograph of the woman in yellow standing beside that farmhouse with a family of 12, and written on the back in black ink were the words, "Killed on Willow Creek Road, October 14th, 1978. Still waiting for a ride home." And Daniel nearly lost his mind because that date was exactly the day he was born. He quit driving. Nights after that, moved houses, changed numbers, even left Chicago. But sometimes at exactly 2:17 in the morning, his phone lights up with a ride request from Willow Creek Road. No passenger name, no profile picture, only one message: "You left before my family got home." And the worst part is, every time that notification appears, muddy footprints slowly form across the floor of his house, leading from the front door to the bedroom where his wife and son sleep. And one morning he woke up to find his little boy sitting at the kitchen table, smiling too wide, softly humming the same lullaby from the woods. And when Daniel asked where he learned that song, the boy looked up with hollow dark eyes and said in a voice that was not his own, "The lady in yellow sings it to me every night. She says Daddy still owes her one last fare." Marcus Reed had been driving a yellow cab in Boston for almost 11 years. And in all that time, he had picked up drunks, angry couples, crying teenagers, strange old men who talked to themselves, and once even a woman carrying a live snake in a pillowcase. But nothing came close to what happened on a freezing November night when he accepted a fare at 3:08 in the morning from a dead-end street near an abandoned church. Because from the second he turned onto that street, something already felt wrong. Not in a normal creepy way, but in that deep animal instinct way where your chest tightens for no reason and your mind quietly tells you to leave, because the entire street was dark even though houses lined both sides. Every porch light was off, every window was black, and there was absolutely no sound. Not a dog barking, not wind moving leaves, not even the hum of power lines. And then his headlights caught a man standing under a dead tree at the end of the road, wearing a black coat and old brown hat, standing perfectly still with his head lowered. And Marcus almost canceled the ride because the man wasn't moving like a normal person waiting for a cab. He looked placed there like part of the darkness itself. But bills were bills, so Marcus pulled up. "Be honest, what would you have done in this situation?" Unlocked the doors, and the man opened the back door and sat directly behind Marcus without saying hello. And the second the door shut, the smell hit him. Wet dirt, rotting wood, and something metallic like old blood, and Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror to see his passenger. But all he could clearly make out was pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones and two eyes that looked strangely glossy, like marbles reflecting light. Then in a dry whisper the man said, "Drive south." And Marcus asked, "South where?" And the man answered, "You'll know." And that sentence sent a cold pressure down Marcus's spine, because he had heard almost those exact words years ago in another strange ride, except that passenger had been alive, or at least Marcus thought so. And as he drove, he kept checking the mirror, and every single time the passenger was staring directly at him, not blinking, not looking away, just staring with those glassy eyes. And after maybe 3 minutes, Marcus noticed something that made his mouth go dry. The passenger's reflection in the mirror was slightly delayed, like when Marcus moved over a bump, the real man's body shifted instantly. but his reflection moved a second later, and then Marcus heard breathing close behind his right ear, even though the passenger was in the back seat. And he quickly turned, but nobody was there, except when he looked in the mirror again. The man was back, smiling faintly. And then Marcus's radio turned on by itself, static filling the cab before a woman's voice whispered clearly, "He sits behind the dying." And the radio shut off, and Marcus's heart began hammering because he had unplugged that radio months ago after it stopped working. There was no power to it at all. Then his headlights flashed over a road sign that made him slam the brakes for a second because it read Blackthorn Road, Cemetery 2 miles. And Marcus knew that road because locals avoided it after multiple fatal crashes there over the years. But from behind him came a voice, no longer dry, but deeper, layered, unnatural, saying, "Keep driving, Marcus." And fear exploded in his chest because he had never told this passenger his name. Then he heard a child giggle from the empty front passenger seat beside him. And slowly, so slowly, he turned his head and saw muddy footprints forming on the seat fabric one after another, as if invisible wet feet were stepping onto it. And then the seat belt clicked by itself, locking around nothing, and a little girl's voice softly asked, "Is he taking us home this time?" And Marcus screamed and nearly crashed. But when he looked again, the seat was empty except for wet black handprints pressed into the leather. And suddenly his rearview mirror tilted upward on its own, showing the back seat. And Marcus's blood froze because there weren't one but 3 passengers now. The man in black sitting in the center, a woman with half her face burned away sitting to his left, and a little boy with stitched lips sitting on his right, all staring directly at Marcus with dead eyes, and all 3 smiled at the same exact moment, their mouths stretching far wider than human mouths should stretch. And then the woman spoke without moving her lips, her voice somehow coming from the cab speakers, saying, "You picked him up where he buried us," and flashes of memory suddenly hit Marcus. News reports years ago about a church groundskeeper named Walter Pike who murdered hitchhikers and buried bodies behind the old church. And Marcus's hand started shaking because his passenger matched Walter Pike's old photo. Except Walter Pike had died in prison 30 years ago. And then from the back seat came a horrible cracking sound like bones snapping one by one. And when Marcus looked in the mirror, Walter's neck had bent sideways at an impossible angle while his smile grew wider, revealing teeth black with dirt, and worms slowly crawled out of his mouth as he whispered, "I was lonely down there." And then every door in the cab locked. Child safety locks clicked on, windows rolled up tight, heater blasted. Freezing cold air and voices began filling the cab. Dozens of whispers, crying, begging, laughing, screaming. So loud Marcus thought his skull would split, and suddenly hands, gray, muddy hands, started pushing through the seat fabric itself, gripping his shoulders, touching his neck, clutching his arms, cold fingers pressing into his skin, and one hand slowly covered his eyes from behind while a voice in his left ear whispered, "Look where you're going." And when the hand lifted, Marcus wasn't on Blackthorn Road anymore. He was driving through a cemetery, tires crushing old graves, headlights flashing over crooked headstones and open burial pits, and figures were crawling out of the ground everywhere, skin hanging loose, jaws broken open, empty eye sockets staring as they dragged themselves toward the moving cab, and some began slamming against the doors and windows, leaving blood and mud smeared across the glass. And one corpse woman with no lower jaw dragged her face across Marcus's window while scratching 3 deep lines into the glass and whispering in a wet gargle, "He buried me breathing." And then something slammed hard onto the roof of the cab, so hard metal caved inward, and long fingers began tapping directly above Marcus's head, tap, 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 then scratching, then pounding violently as if trying to claw through, and black liquid began dripping from the ceiling onto Marcus's lap, thick and smelling like a grave after rain. And when he looked in the rearview mirror one last time, Walter Pike was gone, but sitting directly behind Marcus was Marcus himself, pale, dead-eyed, wearing the same clothes, smiling with blood running from his mouth, and his double leaned forward and whispered, "Move over." I drive now, and icy hands wrapped around Marcus's throat from behind and began choking him while the steering wheel turned sharply on its own toward a massive open grave ahead. And in that second, pure survival hit him. Marcus yanked the emergency brake, grabbed the metal flashlight beside his seat, and smashed the side window with everything he had, throwing himself out of the moving cab just as it rolled into the grave pit and exploded in a burst of orange fire, lighting the cemetery like daylight for one terrifying second. And in that flash, Marcus saw hundreds of dead faces standing silently among the graves, all staring at him. And behind them, taller than all the rest, stood Walter Pike, smiling with dirt pouring endlessly from his mouth. Then darkness returned, and everything vanished. And when police found Marcus at sunrise, half frozen and hysterical on a roadside miles away, there was no cemetery nearby, no burned cab, no crash site, nothing, but there were deep bruises around his throat shaped exactly like human fingers, muddy child footprints across his chest, and 3 scratches carved into the inside of his left arm, reading, "He sits behind the dying." And Marcus never drove again, never slept with lights off, never looked in mirrors at night, because sometimes when he walks past dark windows, he doesn't see his own reflection. He sees the back seat of an old yellow cab and a pale version of himself gripping the wheel, smiling, while something in black sits directly behind him, leaning close to his ear, whispering, "Drive south." It was 2:41 a.m. when Jason Miller, a 29-year-old night taxi driver in Philadelphia, got a ride request that he still cannot explain to this day, because the app he used for driving had one strict rule: no pickups from Millstone Bridge Road after midnight. The area was marked as restricted due to multiple missing persons cases over the years, yet that night the request still came through, glowing on his cracked phone screen like it had bypassed every safety filter, and Jason almost ignored it. But then his phone rang directly, which was even stranger because riders were not supposed to call drivers at all. And when he picked up, there was only silence for 3 seconds before a woman whispered, "Please, don't leave me here again." And the line cut, and Jason sat frozen in his car thinking it was some prank, until his GPS suddenly auto-routed to Millstone Bridge without him touching anything. The steering wheel felt heavier, like the car itself wanted to go there, and against his better judgment, he drove out of the city, past the last streetlights, into an area where even radio signals started dying, and the deeper he went, the colder it became. Not outside temperature cold, but something that felt like pressure inside his chest, like the air itself was watching him. And when he finally reached the bridge, everything was wrong. No cars, no wind, no sound, just an old, rusted bridge hanging over black water that didn't reflect anything. And standing exactly in the middle of it was a woman in a white dress, soaked completely, hair covering her face, not moving, just waiting, and Jason's first instinct was to reverse immediately, but the app pinged again, "Arrived, pickup location," even though there was no signal, no network, nothing, and before he could react, the back door of his car opened by itself, and the woman got in without making a sound, sitting directly behind him, dripping water onto the seats, and the moment the door closed, the inside of the car became freezing, like winter trapped inside metal. And Jason looked in the rearview mirror, but she wasn't looking down or away. She was already staring at him, and her eyes were completely white, no pupils, no color, just blank wet surface, and she whispered, "Drive me home before they find me again." And Jason tried to stay calm and asked, "Where do you live?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she leaned closer, and the mirror showed something worse. Behind her reflection, there were more people sitting in the back seat. Not just her, but at least 3 more shapes, pale and half-transparent, all staring at him with the same dead expression. And Jason's hand started shaking so badly, he almost hit a pole. But when he looked back again, the seat was empty except her, and she smiled slowly, too wide for human face, and said, "You can already hear them, can't you?" And that's when Jason noticed it. Faint knocking sound from inside the trunk, slow, rhythmic-like. Fingernails scratching metal. Then suddenly the radio turned on at full volume, even though the screen was dead, and a man's voice came through screaming, "Don't stop the sir," followed by heavy breathing and then static, and Jason slammed the radio off. But the sound continued outside the car now, like the entire road was breathing. And as he started driving away from the bridge, the rearview mirror fogged up instantly. In the fog, he saw words forming by themselves. Bring US back. And the woman in the back seat suddenly stopped dripping water, and her head slowly tilted sideways until it almost cracked, and she whispered, "They're under the bridge, and they're still awake." And Jason's GPS screen suddenly flashed red and started showing a route that did not exist on any map. Straight into a forest that wasn't there before, trees appearing out of nowhere like they had always been waiting, and his brakes stopped working, not failing, but refusing, like something had taken control, and the car turned itself into the forest road, headlights flickering violently, and every tree they passed had something carved into it. Names, dates, scratches, fresh blood still wet on bark, and Jason started hearing footsteps outside the car, even though he was moving fast, footsteps matching his speed exactly, running beside him in the dark. And then suddenly the woman in the back seat screamed, not loud, but deep, like multiple voices inside one throat. And Jason saw in a mirror her face cracking open like glass, revealing something black moving underneath her skin. And she said, "We didn't drown. We were taken." And then the car completely shut off in the middle of the forest. No engine, no lights, only darkness and silence so heavy Jason could hear his own heartbeat. And then slowly, from outside, knocking started on all four doors at once, soft at first, then harder, then violently fast, and the windows began to fog from the outside. And shapes appeared pressing their faces against the glass, dozens of them, all soaked, all smiling with broken teeth. And one of them was the woman who had entered his car, except now she was outside too, standing directly in front of the hood, pointing at Jason, and through the glass she mouthed the words, "You brought us home." And the trunk suddenly exploded open by itself, and something huge started crawling out, wet, dragging itself across the road toward the driver's door. And Jason finally snapped, grabbing his flashlight and smashing the window, jumping out into the forest, running blindly while hearing his own car doors opening behind him one by one, slow footsteps chasing him, whispering getting louder from every direction, until he tripped and fell in a mud. And when he turned around, there was nothing behind him. No car, no bridge, no forest road, just an empty field under moonlight. And his phone buzzed one last time, showing a completed ride with 5 stars rating from unknown passenger. And a message popped up saying, "Next time, don't leave us waiting under the bridge." I still don't know if I did the right thing. What would you have done if you were me? Tell me in the comments. Jason never drove again after that night, but sometimes at exactly 2:41 a.m., every mirror in his house fogs up on its own, and in that fog he sees wet footprints forming behind him. Even when he is alone, and a soft voice always whispers from nowhere, "We're already in the car."